Okay, y'all. This is uh, my research project on gamification and e-learning compliance training. I'm going to start by talking a little bit about the significance, and I've got my little rabbit and pulling it out of the hat because basically I'm trying to provide some magic to compliance training. Basically, compliance training is pretty boring. Um, the idea here is that games help with learning, and they help us apply adult learning theory in some ways that compliance training usually doesn't offer. Games are engaging and games are effective. So the whole idea is that hopefully this study will help us determine that games can also work really well for compliance training. Which leads us to the purpose. We're going to try and seek to increase engagement and effectiveness of e-learning compliance training using games. We're going to provide a reason to complete compliance training that relates to learners' intrinsic motivations, and we're going to try and motivate learners to apply what they learn in compliance training to their position after completing the training. My questions basically are related to what is the effectiveness of compliance training in adult learners based on the results are based on evaluations that we usually give, which level 2 and level 3 Kirkpatrick evaluations are typical evaluations you give for adult learners. Same thing for engagement, and we're going to base this on level 1 evaluations and focus group interviews. And we're also using time elapsed before an adult learner completes a gamified e-learning module, after a course is assigned and before the course is due, as a measure of engagement. The hypothesis is that games will lead to increased engagement and increased effectiveness. That leads me to our lit review. We use Andragogy as my theoretical framework. They're basically 6 requirements for adult learning theory. And I apologize, my cat wants to participate in our recitation here. But those 6 topics are learning has to be relevant. You have to have self-direction. Adults have to be engaged in their own learning direction. We have to be aware of the fact that adults bring a lot of stuff to the table. So they have their own personal experience and they're building on that. Adults have to be ready to learn based on what's going on in their environment. So it has to be relevant. I guess this goes back to relevance, but it has to be relevant to what they're doing on a day-to-day basis. And adults have to be oriented to learning. So you can't learn calculus until you've taught algebra, basically. And adults also have to be motivated to learn. And compliance training really doesn't usually check that box. So hopefully gamification will help with that. Some of my 5 things, basically engagement and effectiveness are important, but they're really just part of the story. And as we get into the literature, we learn a little bit more about that. So games require proper design, just like any other type of learning. So you have to support learning principles, as well as adult learning theory. So just jumping into the history of games here. Games have been used for forever. Basically, you go back to like Roman and Greek history, and games were used in the military for war games. This guy named Angliger, he came up with something called the business management game around the 50s. And that's probably the earliest that I could find really about people using games in business. And this is really a leadership game. In the early 2000s, Microsoft and MIT physics games were developed for the Xbox. And so this is where we start getting into e-learning and how we use gamification in e-learning. And you can go out actually to the LucasArts website right now and they offer some Star Wars games for critical thinking for teachers, which is pretty cool. There's a lot of stuff out there that says that games are engaging. There was a computer API that was developed that was used to measure emotions in a line learning game. And this actually showed, versus basically like a lecture setting, that participants that used the game were far more expressive and showed more joy and fear. I thought that was an interesting one, of getting the answer wrong, than people who just took like the standard lecture setting. And so that showed positive engagement in the game. And in general, students who take games or play games for learning are more engaged in the game when it's used for practice and positive reinforcement. For effectiveness, this guy actually used a game for positive reinforcement, training, basically training dogs to sit, which is kind of cool. In this study, they showed that after 1 month, those in the game group actually retained more knowledge than those in the lecture group based on the final exams. There's an economics class that also used a self-study stimulation game as a supplement to the curriculum, and found that the game, where people ranked in the game, correlated with overall class rank. And there was a pretty cool narrative-based game that they used to discover disease vectors. And those who spent more time efficiently in the game, creating and testing plausible hypotheses, were far more likely to discover the disease vectors, which makes sense. But it also shows that when games are developed effectively, people are actually more likely to be effective. There's not a whole lot out there on compliance research. I found one person who'd done research on Sarbanes-Oxley training, and it showed minimal improvement in effectiveness, basically. Good games are a lot like good training. You have to match up with learning outcomes. You have to be focused on behavioral objectives. We use something called ADDIE in instructional design, which is you have to analyze, you have to know what the needs are, you have to use good design process and good development process before you implement the training. And that's so true in games, just like it is in learning anything else. And I really like this quote. This is from the Andlinger article. The goal of learning games is not to win, but to learn. So let's get into my study. So we're going to do a game using CTPAT, which is compliance training, which is customs compliance. It is so boring. But we're going to try and jazz it up and create a narrative game where you're this customs inspector and you have to go in and figure out what in the office environment you can do to comply with the customs enforcement policies. So I've got 500 employees at Fruit of the Loom in Bowling Green. We're going to be restricting them to the Bowling Green office. I don't have any information on things like gender or anything like that yet, but I'm going to try and collect that demographic information as part of the study. I'm going to collect gender. I'm going to collect generational status, which is things like, are you a millennial? Are you Gen Z, Gen X? Are you a boomer? Or are you part of, I guess the greatest generation is probably the final generation we might have in the workplace. And also, are you a gamer? Do you play games already? Because that was something that's interesting that came out in the literature, that people who already play games may be more effective at gaming. Of course, we use non-probability convenient sampling because that's who we have for our sample. We have several different measures and instruments. I'm going to use a pre and post test for my effectiveness. It's just 5 questions. Basically, how are you doing before and how are you doing after? I have a 9-question 5-point Likert scale that tests effectiveness and engagement. And this is basically our level 1 evaluation. It also has one open-ended question. And those are all our quantitative measures. I've also going to be using focus group interviews, and that'll further explore effectiveness and engagement after I've got my first level of data. So this is my timeline. It's a bit different than everybody else's. I'm going to design my module in January, and I can't implement until May. This is something that my workplace is requiring. I'm going to actually implement May 1st. I'm going to allow 2 weeks for people to take the module. In June, I'll be doing my focus groups, and in July, I'll complete my analysis, which means I can't graduate till August. Sorry, guys. Won't be graduating with the rest of you. So on to the data analysis plan. Of course, I'll collect my data when the game is administered, and then shortly after that through my focus groups. So I'm going to be doing a mixed method study, but because I can't collect my data until later, I'm going to be doing an explanatory study, which is a little bit different. Because of this delayed data collection, I'm going to be doing quantitative data first, and then I'm going to be able to use that to inform my qualitative focus group analysis. So I get to use people to explain the hard data, which is pretty cool. I get to develop questions based on what I get to see from my my Likert scales and stuff like that. My quantitative analysis is basically going to be my pre-post test, my Likert scale, and my extraneous and demographic data. For effectiveness and my pre-post tests, I'm going to be doing descriptive statistics, which could be things like frequency, means, percentages, standard deviations, and dependent t-tests for inferential statistics. For the Likert scale for effectiveness, I will be doing frequency, percentages, means, and standard deviations, more descriptive statistics, and inferential statistics will probably be independent t-tests. For engagement, I also have that Likert scale. Again, same basic concepts, frequency, percentage, means, standard deviations, and independent t-tests. And for the elapsed time for engagement, I'll be using descriptive statistics that are the same thing and independent t-tests. My demographic data is a little bit more interesting. I've got gender, generational status, and gamer status. And I've got some statistical analyses that will be descriptive statistics, count, percentage, mean, standard deviation, skewness, and kurtosis levels. And my inferential statistics will be independent t-tests for gender and ANOVA for the other two demographics. Qualitative analysis. These are just semi-structured focus groups, so they'll be coded into categories. So what's next? My conclusion. The conclusion we came up with for the thesis lit review was games work as long as they're designed to support learning rather than replace it. And we don't know a whole lot about compliance training, so we need more investigation, which is where this project comes in. So that's all I've got for you now. Hopefully we'll have more fun stuff later once the project is done.